a bit of a rough overview of where we're at with the British agricultural and food system, which, as Claire says, is an incredibly difficult task. It's enormously complex. It involves a huge variety of parts and sectors of industry, from producing food to packaging and distributing, selling and preparing food. And so I'm only going to give a real general outline. And before I do that, I just want to say that hopefully my fellow panellists will touch on this much more, but there is a long, long tradition in Britain of people in the agricultural sector, in the food production sector, and the food distribution and sales sector of organising amongst trade unions, amongst their communities, to fight both for their own rights at work and their own living and working conditions, which sometimes, and I'll come on to this in a little bit, in the agricultural sector in particular, are far worse than in urban areas, and also as part of an argument and a desire for a better food system for everyone. I'm going to try and centre my remarks by exploring two recent news stories. The first of which was the news that was very prominent last week, but has now almost disappeared again, about the impact of the recent very heavy weather on British agriculture and what that means for food production here in the UK. The other news story, again, which has kind of slipped off the news agenda, is the protests by farmers that have taken place in Britain, particularly in Wales, but not just in Wales, and across Europe. In Britain, I'll start with the farmers' protests. But I want to, these two stories seemingly are separate, but I want to use them as a way of trying to explore the problems of the British food and agricultural system and its environmental impact. Now, the farmer protests have got a lot of news coverage, far more news coverage than any trade union demonstration and protest and strike would ever receive, given the numbers actually involved. They've organised around the slogan, "No farmers, no food, no future," which superficially is an accurate slogan. It's quite a significant movement. It's not on the scale of Europe, where literally hundreds of thousands of farmers and associated producers have been on the streets from France across to Poland. It's not on that scale here in Britain, but it nonetheless is on a large scale. And it's big enough, for instance, for Tory MPs, for Rishi Sunak to have felt that they've got to go and take part in these protests. And I think that's an interesting thing in and of itself. And it's attracted support from people who wouldn't normally support protests. Jeremy Clarkson, now I'm a public sector worker, I remember in 2011 when we were out striking for pensions, Jeremy Clarkson said that strikers should be shot in front of their families. That's a direct quote. But Jeremy Clarkson is, for instance, very happy to support the farmers. Now, the mainstream news has focused on the farmers' demands and concerns about two things, one of which is low cost food imports that's damaging business. The other is alleged proposals, particularly from the Welsh Government, that they are around the environment, which is why it's pertinent to this conference, that they allege will severely impact upon their on farming and agriculture. They say that there's a plan to make in Wales 10% of farmland under tree cover, new rules over fertiliser pollution and animal manure to protect rivers, and the refusal to cull badgers. Now, the National Farmers Union, which is not a union and is not part of the TUC, but they call themselves the National Farmers Union, in Wales argue that this could lead to a 11% cut in labour on Welsh farms. That's over 5,500 jobs and millions of pounds going. Now, the problem with these demands is most of them are not true. And there has been a concerted attempt by the right wing to link the proposals from the Welsh Government, and they are at the stage of proposals, to an assault on agriculture, on the farming community, on farmers in particular, through the guise of environmental protection. And some of the leading figures in it, I haven't got time to go into details, but George Monbiot on this has been very, very good, have included people who are very much associated with conspiracy theories around COVID, lockdowns and ultra-low emissions and opposition to net zero and so on. Just as an example of this, the figure around the 10% that farmers are very worried about, that 10% of land will have to be covered by trees, isn't certainly not true. The Woodland Trust point out that this is about extending existing farmland, not imposing this upon farmers. Nonetheless, there's a huge amount of this stuff has become mainstream and has become articulated by Tory MPs and Rishi Sunak. Now, the slight problems of this: firstly, Rishi Sunak actually went on a demonstration that was blocking a road in Wales on this protest, essentially protesting against the policies of his own government, in a way that if it had been just Stop Oil, he would have condemned. The problem, I think, is that what is happening here is that a very small number of actually quite unusual section of the rural community, the richer middle farmers, are protesting and are being supported by the mainstream media and the government, yet they're not representative of actually the food production system as a whole. And what's happening is they're becoming emblematic of a crisis in farming, and thus emblematic of a particular solution that's very of interest to big business and multinationals, and has been pushed by successive governments. And this does nothing, despite Sunak saying that his speech that he's concerned about what will happen to jobs, your livelihoods, your incomes and food production. Actually, it's not having anything to say for the vast majority of people involved in the food industry or in the agricultural and rural communities. That brings me on to the second news report, which colleagues may have seen, which is that we've had the highest level of rainfall in 18 months, which is having a significant and systematic impact upon British agricultural and food production. Wheat production is down this year 15%, oilseed rape is down 28%, winter barley is down 22%. These are going to leave Britain dependent on food incomes, or further dependent on food incomes for the next 12 months. And this again is adding to the sort of crisis that is squeezing rural communities and forcing some people to protest in what are quite essentially demonstrations that are taking on right-wing positions. What these two stories show, I think, is that British farming and food production and the food production system is not sustainable. It doesn't support rural communities, food producers or farmers, and it doesn't provide healthy, safe and nutritious food. Yet the crisis in British farming is being used as an excuse by the Tory government and many other commentators to offer us more of the same. And that's quite frightening. As we know, post-Second World War food system has become dominated by large multinational corporations at almost every level, except for the actual production of food. The supermarket chains that dominate the distribution and the sale of food, the massive corporations that dominate distribution and the supply of fertilizers, chemicals, and so on. And that's been a conscious set of policies since post-Second World War, indeed since the Second World War itself. And the overarching aim of this has been to produce a food system that is geared not towards feeding people sustainably and healthily, but maximising profits at every area of that chain. Yet the people who have been squeezed most by it are the people who do the work on farms, the work in the distribution sectors and so on, and the producers in particular. So it's not just a particular problem for Britain, it's a model of food production that started in the 30s and 40s in North America and has been exported around the world. And it's a model of food production that has really left working class people and the majority of people involved in the production of food very much in a negative position. More than 40% of the communities in rural Wales who are allegedly represented by these rich farmers live in fuel poverty. 300,000 people in rural communities are on the waiting list for social housing in England, where the average rural house price is now over £420,000. And rural workers are often worse paid, they're isolated, they're older, and they're at higher risk of injury and death, and are earning on average less than their counterparts in urban areas. And my point, I suppose, is that the focus on a small group of relatively wealthy farmers who are being squeezed, but is taking place to ignore the wider situation for working people across the food sector. People who Sarah represents, who work at the point of sales, the people who produce and distribute food, and so on. The problem, however, I think, is that we as a left, as a trade union, as an environmental movement, haven't yet worked out a way to reach out to those sectors in a way that breaks them from a dominant right-wing narrative and makes it easier for us to organise. And for my last point then, and I'm running out of time, Chair, and so I'll try and do this in 1 minute, is that we need to come up with a set of demands around sustainable food production and rural agricultural working life, which are popular and attract people, but don't make the people who are producing food feel that they're being made to pay the cost of the environmental crisis. So there's some simple things we could do. For instance, we should reinstate the Agricultural Wages Board that was abolished in 2013 by a previous Tory government. We should demand the better pay and conditions for those who work in agriculture, who aren't just farmers, but are people who drive and dig and cut. We should make sure that there's absolute equality of work and an opposition to any form of racism directed at the migrant labour who does work on in this industry, not just in agriculture but in every other sector and so on. We should argue, I think, explicitly for a model of nature conservation and restoration in the countryside that is about regions and states and government acting and funding, not pushing the onus upon farmers and producers who are then felt that they are being squeezed and made to do things which impact upon their lives and livelihoods and so on. There's a whole host of them, and Claire's chapter in the Climate Jobs pamphlet explores many, many more of these. The final thing, I think, though, and I think this is demonstrated by the history of organising in the countryside and organising amongst the food system, is that a powerful left and trade union movement is the key thing, if you want, that can start to raise and bring and win people to a model and a vision of sustainable agriculture that isn't dominated by mass corporations and big industry. And that won't come simply from having the right slogans or the right pamphlets. It will come from us building movements like the Land Workers Alliance and so on, who are engaging and working with communities and trying to develop new forms of agriculture, but doing so in a way that builds links and solidarity with other workers in the countryside and the food sector. It's an urgent task because agriculture is in crisis and is a significant contributor to the environmental destruction. Nonetheless, I think it is one that we can win.